Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on something really important, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC Mains exams. We're talking about, of course, India-Sri Lanka relations. And this is, well, let's just say it's more exciting than your typical textbook analysis. We're diving into President AKD's recent visit to India, his first trip abroad since taking office.
Yes, first trip. And it's pretty interesting because AKD is often seen as closer to China. So him choosing India for his first diplomatic visit, that sends a message, doesn't it? It really
It
does.
does. It's almost like Sri Lanka is trying to walk a tightrope between these two powerful neighbors.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what were some of the moments, the key moments, that really jumped out at you from this visit?
Well, I think from a strategic perspective, India definitely got a win. AKD assured India that Sri Lanka would not, allow its territory to be used for anything against India's interests. This was a big deal for India, especially with concerns about Chinese influence, particularly with those Chinese companies in Sri Lankan ports. There's been a lot of talk about that.
That makes sense. India's security in the Indian Ocean is a top priority. It always has been. But this visit wasn't all smiles and handshakes, right? There were some sticking points too, especially when it comes to the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka.
Oh, absolutely. India has been pushing Sri Lanka to fully implement the 13th Amendment to their constitution. You see, the amendment, it came after the Civil War, and it was supposed to give more power to the Tamil community. It's a complicated issue, really complicated, with a lot of history behind it.
Yeah, for our listeners who might not be as familiar with this, can you break down why this 13th Amendment is such a sensitive topic?
Sure. So basically, the 13th Amendment was supposed to give more power to provincial councils. This would mean that Tamil majority areas would get more autonomy, at least in theory. But the problem is it's never been fully implemented. And that's created this tension between India, which wants to see it implemented to protect Tamil rights, and Sri Lankan governments, who haven't really wanted to give up that much power.
So where does AKD stand on all of this? How does he fit into this?
Well, he hasn't been shy about expressing his, let's say, reservations about the 13th Amendment. He's even pushed back against calls for investigations into, alleged war crimes during the conflict with the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE. And this obviously creates friction with India, which sees the 13th Amendment as this key step toward reconciliation and stability.
It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? Sri Lanka trying to balance its relationship with India and its own domestic politics. But one thing that struck me was how confident AKD seemed during these discussions. It's not easy to say no to a powerful neighbor like India.
You're right. He did seem very confident, and I think a lot of that comes from his strong position domestically. He's got a comfortable parliamentary majority, which gives him more leverage on the international stage. He doesn't have the same internal political pressures that some of his predecessors had.
That's interesting. So a strong domestic position leads to a more assertive foreign policy. But do you think is this deliberate? Is he trying to project a new image of Sri Lanka on the world stage?
That's a good question. And I think there are signs that suggest he might be. Look at his anti-corruption campaign, for example. It's been really popular, and it seems to be working. And combine that with his more confident approach to diplomacy, it could be an attempt to rebrand Sri Lanka, present it as a more stable, reform-minded nation, a place that's attractive for foreign investment.
I see your point. We often forget how closely connected domestic and foreign policy are. And AKD seems to understand that connection. But let's shift gears a bit. We focused a lot on the politics, but there's another side to this relationship.
Yeah.
There's a lot of potential for cooperation between India and Sri Lanka, particularly in terms of development.
Absolutely. This visit wasn't just about disagreements. There were a lot of concrete development projects on the table. Things ranging from housing and renewable energy to better digital connections and transportation.
Yeah, I noticed some specifics that stood out, like the proposed Indian housing project, a hybrid renewable energy project, and then there's this really interesting idea of using India's Aadhaar and UPI systems in Sri Lanka. Can you talk a bit more about that last one? It seems like a major development.
Yeah, it is. Aadhaar is India's biometric ID system, and UPI is their mobile payment platform. Imagine implementing these systems in Sri Lanka. It could be a huge change for their economy, really. Streamlined transactions, more financial inclusion, fewer bureaucratic hurdles. It could really boost Sri Lanka and potentially attract a lot more foreign investment.
And for India, it strengthens ties with a strategically important neighbor. Sounds like a win-win, at least on paper. And speaking of strategic interests, there's also been talk of potential energy cooperation between the two.
Oh, yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. There's potential for India to supply LNG to Sri Lanka, helping them with their energy shortages. And then there are these discussions about developing a Trincomalee, a port city in Sri Lanka, as a regional energy hub. Now, this has big implications. Trincomalee has a deep natural harbor, and it's in a strategically important location on those crucial shipping lanes.
Wow, so developing that into an energy hub could really reshape the energy landscape of the whole region. That's a big deal.
It is, and it's not just that. They're also looking at collaborating on offshore wind power, and maybe even connecting the power grids of both countries.
So it's not all just political maneuvering, it's about real projects with real economic impact. This partnership, if it works out, could be transformative for both countries, especially in terms of energy security and economic development.
It has that potential, definitely. But of course, there are challenges. To implement these projects, you need political will, coordination, and you have to navigate the geopolitics of the region, which is never simple.
Yeah, the real world is always more complicated. And speaking of complexity, we can't ignore the defense and security aspect of this relationship. It's kind of the elephant, or maybe the lion in the room, you could say.
Right, right. Even with all the talk of development and cooperation, there's a definite security angle. The sources mention potential agreements on defense cooperation, things like joint exercises, maritime surveillance, cybersecurity, and counterterrorism.
So looking at the big picture, why is this security cooperation so important for both countries?
Well, if you zoom out a bit, both India and Sri Lanka see each other as important partners for keeping the Indian Ocean stable. They both face threats like terrorism and piracy, and they understand the benefits of working together to address these.
And let's not forget about China's growing presence in the region. It adds another layer to all of this. It seems like both India and Sri Lanka are interested in strengthening their ties, even with a new leader in Sri Lanka and all the challenges that come with that.
Absolutely, and that's a key takeaway for our listeners preparing for the UPSC exams. The relationship between India and Sri Lanka goes deeper than individual leaders. There's strategic logic at play, they share interests, and they both see the need to work together on these challenges.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So even with the new president, the basics of this relationship haven't changed. But what about AKD's personal style? It seems like he's bringing something new to the table.
He is, and that's worth paying attention to. His confidence, his willingness to assert Sri Lanka's own interests, his focus on economic development, all of this could really influence how India-Sri Lanka relations develop in the future.
It's fascinating to see how domestic politics and individual leaders can shape international relations. But I think we've covered a lot of ground today. So let's pick up here next time and continue our deep dive into this crucial relationship. We'll be back soon with more analysis and insights, so stay tuned.
Looking forward to it. So we're back, continuing our deep dive into India-Sri Lanka relations. It's a topic that's definitely making headlines. And for anyone prepping for those UPSC mains exams, it's essential stuff.
Absolutely. Before the break, we were discussing how AKD's leadership style is really changing the dynamic of this relationship. He's not afraid to, well, play hardball, even with a major power like India.
He's certainly more assertive than his predecessors. And it's interesting because this could go either way. On one hand, it might help Sri Lanka negotiate better deals, get more favorable terms for themselves. But on the other hand, it could also cause friction. Put a strain on things with India.
It's a delicate balancing act for AKD. He has to project strength, but also make sure he doesn't alienate a key partner. And this is the kind of nuanced analysis that UPSC examiners love. But let's step back for a second and think about the core issues for our listeners. What are the key takeaways they should be focusing on when trying to understand this complex relationship?
I think the first thing to grasp is the strategic importance of Sri Lanka. Not just for India, but for China too. It's like this small island nation caught in a tug of war between two giants.
Right, exactly. Sri Lanka's location in the Indian Ocean makes it a really valuable partner for both countries. And that puts Sri Lanka in a tough spot. They have to play it smart, try to benefit from both sides without getting too close to either one.
A classic balancing act, you could say. And for UPSC aspirants, this is a perfect example of how geography, economics, and politics all come together to shape a country's foreign policy.
A real-world case study right in front of us. So thinking about all of that, how do you see this relationship evolving in the years ahead? What are the big factors that will determine whether this partnership succeeds or fails?
Well, there are a few things to consider. First, Sri Lanka's economic recovery is critical. If AKD can actually deliver on his promises of development and prosperity, it will strengthen his position both at home and internationally.
It'll give him more leverage when he's negotiating with India and China.
Yeah.
If Sri Lanka is seen as a stable, growing economy, he'll be in a better position to strike those deals.
Exactly. The second thing to watch is China's reaction to this strengthening of ties between India and Sri Lanka. Will they see it as a threat? Will they try to counter it? Or will they just wait and see how things play out?
It's a fascinating dynamic between these three players. And understanding how they interact is key to understanding the whole region. That's the kind of big picture thinking that the UPSC is looking for.
Couldn't agree more. And the third thing we can't ignore is domestic politics. In both India and Sri Lanka, of course, upcoming elections, public opinion, internal tensions, all of these can have a big impact on foreign policy decisions.
It's all connected, isn't it? Domestic politics, economic interests, security concerns, the ambitions of individual leaders, it all comes together to create this complex web of international relations.
Exactly. And that's why staying informed and being able to analyze these interconnected factors is so important, not just for doing well on your UPSC exams, but for understanding the world we live in.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, a question to ponder as they continue their UPSC preparations. We've talked a lot about India and Sri Lanka and how they're managing their relationship with each other and with China. But what about the other players in the region?
That's a great point. We can't forget about the bigger picture. Countries like Japan, Australia, the United States, they all have interests in the Indian Ocean. How might they react to these shifting dynamics between India and Sri Lanka?
It's like a game of chess, a multidimensional one. Every player is making moves, trying to predict what the others will do. Understanding these complex interactions is what sets apart a good UPSC candidate from a truly great one.
You're absolutely right. It's not about memorizing facts and figures. It's about developing the skills to connect the dots, see the big picture, and anticipate what's coming next.
And that's exactly what we aim to do here on the Deep Dive. We want to give you the knowledge and the critical thinking skills to excel, not just on your exams, but in life in general. So if you're finding these insights helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this episode with your fellow UPSC aspirants.
We're here to help you navigate the world of international relations, one deep dive at a time.
And on that note, let's shift gears and get ready for the final part of our deep dive. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up our analysis of India-Sri Lanka relations with some key takeaways and predictions for what the future holds. Stay with us. All right, we'll be back for the last part of our deep dive into India-Sri Lanka relations. We've talked about a lot, from AKD's diplomatic moves to the potential for cooperation on the economic and security fronts. But for our UPSC aspirants out there who are diligently taking notes and trying to piece it all together, what are the big takeaways, the things they should really be focusing on?
Well, one of the main things to remember is that even with the change in leadership in Sri Lanka, the core interests that are driving this relationship, they haven't really changed. Both countries still see this partnership as important, especially now with the increasing geopolitical competition in the Indian Ocean.
So even with a leader like AKD who's seen as being closer to China, the underlying strategic logic of this partnership, it's still there, it's holding strong. But things aren't exactly static, are they? I mean, AKD's style of leadership, it's definitely adding a new element to all of this.
Definitely, he's more assertive, more willing to push for what he wants in negotiations, and maybe less likely to just follow India's lead. This could be a good thing for Sri Lanka. It could help them get better deals, assert their own interests more forcefully. But there are also risks.
Risks like maybe pushing India away or causing some friction in their relationship. It's a balancing act, that's for sure. It'll be interesting to see how AKD manages all of this in the long run. But for our listeners who might be thinking, okay, so what? What does all of this mean for the future? What's your take? What are your predictions for how this relationship will play out in the coming years?
Well, I think we can expect to see continued efforts to strengthen those economic ties, especially in areas like energy, infrastructure, and digital technology. Those sectors offer benefits for both countries, and they're not as politically sensitive as issues like the 13th Amendment, for example.
So focusing on those practical, mutually beneficial projects, that might be the key to keeping things moving in the right direction, even when those political differences pop up.
Exactly. And I also think we'll see more security cooperation driven by shared concerns about terrorism, piracy, and the growing influence of other countries in the Indian Ocean. Things like joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, maritime surveillance. These are all areas where I expect to see closer collaboration between India and Sri Lanka.
So even though AKD might be trying to broaden Sri Lanka's foreign policy options, he still sees India as a vital partner for security. It's complicated, but that's geopolitics for you.
It is. No country can afford to rely solely on one partner. Sri Lanka needs to maintain those good relations with both India and China while also pursuing its own interests.
High stakes, definitely. And for our UPSC aspirants who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this, remember, this is exactly the kind of analysis that the exam requires. You need to be able to understand those complex relationships, identify the key factors, and anticipate future trends. That's what sets those successful candidates apart.
Absolutely. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about developing that deep understanding of the forces that shape international relations. And that's what we've aimed to do today with this deep dive into India-Sri Lanka relations.
Well said. We've looked at the history, the current dynamics, the main players involved, and the potential challenges and opportunities ahead. Hopefully, this has given our listeners a more complete and nuanced view of this really important relationship.
And for those preparing for the UPSC, remember, take good notes, analyze those key takeaways, and think critically about how this example might be relevant for other areas you're studying.
Great advice. And if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your fellow UPSC aspirants. We're here to help you on your journey to success, one insightful episode at a time.
Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those minds sharp.
And that's a wrap on another episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time. And until then, stay curious.